Okay. Welcome everyone. I'm introducing myself because I've got a lot to talk about and only 45 minutes to talk about it in, so we'll see how we go. This is my little talk, the Web Micro Framework Battle. That's as exciting as the slides get, by the way. AKA, I survey the landscape, so you probably might not have to. We'll see how we go. By way of introduction, I work for a telco. I primarily develop systems for routing phone calls and SMSs and texts, the Americans might know them as, and provisioning phone numbers and things like that, very exciting stuff. I also maintain websites, but I'm not talking about them today. I'm talking about the lots of little discrete systems that I develop for my telco work. Okay, so I have all these little systems and they're all connected through HTTP. I love connecting things up with HTTP because it's nice and simple. And it also offers the ability for, since we've already got HTTP there, we can whack a very, very, very simple user interface on top of my little systems to, poke at them, see how they're going. Okay? So HTTP is my kind of RPC layer for having systems talk to each other. So I end up writing all these little HTTP systems all the time. And over the period of the last kind of 12 years or so that I've been doing Python, 15 years, I've written at least half a dozen little micro frameworks. So it occurred to me that I probably should stop doing that and start using somebody else's because they'll be more robust and maybe a little bit more featureful. So I started looking at the landscape and I started looking at specific elements of these frameworks to figure out which one would probably be best for me. And I'm talking about what's best for me here. Everybody will have different criteria, and that will become apparent, I hope. So what's the standard library, as you will, for the micro frameworks that I'm looking at? Kind of the really most important thing is I don't want to have to spend time figuring out how the thing works, okay? It's got to be really obvious, really good, well documented, a minimum of magic. There's got to be no surprises in how it does things, and it's got to be terse. I don't have to type a lot just to make my application work as a web service. It's just got to be really quick and easy. It's got to handle all the HTTP stuff, obviously. Handle form requests. It's got to do the URL routing so requests are sent off to the right bit of code, and again with a minimum of fuss. I like RESTful approach of things, so it's got to be able to distinguish between different types of HTTP methods in the requests. And WSGI is nice because it allows me to plug in a few little bits of middleware that we've developed for handling database connections and things. And it's nice to be able to then plug it into other web servers down the track, so that's nice. Support for PyPy is really good. We've got a bunch of our servers that do a whole lot of number crunching or word crunching as well, and we're starting to migrate those over to using PyPy because it's really, really, really fast. So supporting PyPy is really good. Supporting Python 3 is something I chucked in there because it's not actually a requirement for me, but I thought I'd see how they all go anyway, just to see where they're all at. Oh, one thing about the docs, downloadable documentation is really good. I do a lot of offline development, so if they have downloadable documentation, that's a bonus as well. Okay, the things that are out. I don't care about ORMs. The stuff that I do, typically we're writing code that's fairly simple, and we like having explicit SQL in our code. We don't want to have the magic of an ORM layer abstracting away what the SQL is actually doing. So we like having direct SQL. So any sort of database wrapper really. DB API directly. There's an extension module for DB API called DB API EXT, which is actually quite nice as well. It extends kind of the functionality of DB API. We use that a little bit, but it doesn't obscure the SQL in any way. SQL Alchemy also works, so if we do end up extending things to using that, then that's fine too, but I don't need a framework to supply the database layer. I don't care about templating either, because generally I don't have a complex user interface, and if I do end up needing templating, then there's tons of template engines out there. I don't need the framework to give me a template engine. So the things that are out, all the mega frameworks, I don't care about those. There's too much baggage. You can't get a trivial little application that I've written wrapped and presentable as HTTP using any of these things. Cubic Web popped up recently. I'd never heard of it. Mueller is a new one. It's too young. There's bits missing. Pump came in too late to be included. And I did actually evaluate combining routes and WebOb, but the result was too complicated, so I'm not presenting that today. Okay, so what I did to evaluate them all was I developed a trivial little application, a wiki. So I developed a core of the application that handles the storage and the generation of HTML to present to the user. That's kind of like the core of what the application does. So then the frameworks then just have to handle the HTTP part and sending information to and from the user. Okay, so the wiki has a very simple structure. We have get a page and display it to the user. We have editing a page and presenting a form and handling the form. I also implemented a history view and reversion view to kind of reinforce the framework's approach, but it's not included in the slides today because it's just extraneous and it's not interesting to present that today. It's got to handle redirects and not founds. So if the framework doesn't handle getting the fave icon sanely, then that's not good. Okay, so these are the contenders. These are the ones that I actually evaluated. I did actually evaluate web.py and pyramid and routes and WebOb, but I gave up on the first two very quickly. And as I say, I did routes and WebOb, but it was just too verbose, so it's out. So there's 10 left. CGI and WSGI refers to the standard Python library. So there's 10 in all, and the top one is my kind of baseline. If something's harder than that, then it's not worth looking at. And again, the criteria, it's got to be documented, easy to use, minimum magic, RESTful, WSGI, Python 3 is nice, PyPy is awesome, minimum amount of typing, and also the size of the framework itself, lines of code in the framework that I have to poke into when the framework docs let me down. That's an important consideration as well. Okay, so straight in, CGI and WSGI ref. Awesome documentation. It's in the standard library. It's got really good documentation, and it's pretty easy to use. There's a lot of typing, but it's actually not that hard. There's a reason why I kept writing my own web frameworks, because it's so easy. But there's no extras. There's also no magic. It's not RESTful because there's no application, but it does do WSGI when you write your own application, that is. So that's nice. So you do have to write your own web application, and again, this is why I keep writing my own, because this is it. This is a web application. This is a micro framework, basically. It handles the WSGI part, so generating a response and accepting the arguments and generating a response, and it can farm off requests to a URL, to handlers based on the incoming URL and request method. We'll see the pattern of, or see the contents of URLs later, but it's basically just a URL pattern, a request method, and something to call if it's a match. So it's really easy. And then we've got some handling of exceptions. So if there's no match, not found, handle the not found exception and redirect exception, and away we go. The actual application itself is pretty simple. Hitting no URL, we redirect to front page. Rendering a page is straightforward. If it's not a wiki name, then we raise not found. Otherwise, we return the page rendered, the edit form rendered, or handle the edit. Now, you can see, obviously, when we handle the edit, we have to manually invoke the CGI module to actually pull apart the request that's coming in. But that's, again, it's pretty straightforward. It's mentioned in the documentation, and it's not a lot of work, and I could probably actually farm this off to the top level application and handle this in all cases and pass the form data in. So again, this is why I keep writing my own framework, but it is pretty bare bones. These callables are then listed in a URLs listing. Again, URL map pattern, the request method, and the callable. And then we serve that with simple server, and that's it. Pretty simple and straightforward. So let's see what the actual frameworks give us on top of that. The first one I looked at was Bobo, and I looked at Bobo first because I've got a bit of a history with Bobo. Bobo started out life as this awesome object publishing system back in the 90s. It was one of the first. It was great. It was basically take an object tree of Python objects and publish it to the web. Parse a URL looking for attributes and items on these objects and display the result to the user. It was great. It became Zope. Then Zope grew, and Bobo kind of got tainted along the way. So Bobo now isn't the same as Bobo then. Unfortunately, the documentation for Bobo is kind of limited, and it's very much focused on the Bobo way of doing things. It wasn't straightforward. It took me quite a long time to figure out how it worked. And I couldn't just create an app and publish it, and we'll get to that. So this is kind of what the index, the top level index function looks like in Bobo. And this is basically saying, if we match a URL that's just a slash, then call this thing. And then we return the Bobo redirect. Bobo here is the module, by the way. I've imported Bobo, and this is the module. This gave me some weird transient errors, like I would end up being redirected to slash front page slash, but then I'd restart it and it didn't anymore, and I had no idea why, so that was weird. And there's no redirect exception. I like raising redirects as exceptions because you can do it way down deep in your code. You can say redirect, and you don't have to worry about returning it all the way back up. So that was a shame. On the other hand, you can raise not found, so it's kind of weird. This is where it got confusing. So the first example is simply bobo.query, and here's the pattern. To handle the slash name part of the URL, I've got to do a subroute. So what this is basically saying is, if the URL matches slash name, then instantiate one of these objects and pass the name in as an argument to what you're creating. It could also be a function, I believe, but in this case I'm creating an object which is then published. And then it uses the rest of the URL, it parses the rest of the URL to look for things on that object to publish. So if the rest of the URL is blank, we return the page itself, so that's slash page name. But otherwise we've stored name off on the object. The says scan thing there, if I don't specify scan, I got this bizarro error that was just opaque as all hell. So I had to put scan in, and we'll get back to the why, exactly why in a moment. Where are we? Yeah, and the docs weren't clear. The docs seemed to imply that if I just had bobo.query, it would publish a thing called index, but that didn't happen at all. I had to actually specify an explicit name every time for bobo.query. Here, these are two more methods on that object, so edit and post, do edit. So these are then handling slash page name slash edit, and doing that sort of stuff. So there's actually a bug in this slide. It should be render edit form self.name. That's my fault in editing the slide. And then later on, of course, handling the post. Nice thing about Bobo is that the form variables are pulled out of the request based on the function signature. So that's really nice. I don't have to manually look at some sort of form object to find the things I'm looking for. And that's really nice. And that was a feature in the very, very first Bobo as well. So it was way ahead of its time. Another really odd thing is, notice I have to specify get and post even though I'm saying bobo.post and bobo.query. If I don't specify the request method, bobo.post handles both get and post. Yeah, so that's weird. It gets weirder. To actually make this serve HTTP, I do this. I import Bobo server and I say boboserver.serve in a list -f file name. You what now? So we're publishing the module file. We're not publishing the object I've just created. I mean, this is pretty wacky. There doesn't appear to be any way of getting a WSGI app out of Bobo. You can use paste deploy to kind of construct a WSGI app, but paste deploy is quite opaque, and it's a whole other level of configuration and installation and stuff I didn't have to deal with just for a simple web app. So I poked around the source for ages trying to figure out how to make this work, and I just couldn't. So, weird. Okay. The next one I looked at was CherryPy, and it actually is quite similar to Bobo in some respects, but only after you tweak it a little bit. By default, CherryPy is not restish. It doesn't do any distinction in its URL handling, its request handling to distinguish between get and post. You can get that by changing the default dispatcher to be a method dispatcher. The downside is that the only documentation about method dispatcher is quite light on, and I actually had to start guessing at some things. Fortunately, I guessed right, but it was a bit disturbing. On the other hand, the docs use Sphinx, which is nice. It's, anything that uses Sphinx for documentation gets a +1, really. So this is what the CherryPy application looks like. And like in Bobo where we did that subroute thing, we're doing a CherryPy pop arg, which is basically saying the first bit of the URL, pop that off as name. The weird thing is, if the first bit of the URL isn't there, then you just get no name passed into the get method. So it's basically each segment of the URL is handled by an object which has get and post and whatever other HTTP methods on it. And then sub-components of the URL are handled by other attributes on the class. So /name/edit is handled by the wiki edit object. Exposed is a funny thing. It can be done in a bunch of different ways, using a decorator, using a manual function attribute assignment, and it's not at all clearly explained in one place. It took me a while to figure out the different ways you can do exposed. So this is the edit, and again, it's when CherryPy's URL parsing hits this object, it's just looking for a get or a post method to handle the get and post of the request. And like Bobo, it automatically says, look, the function has these arguments, try and pull those out of the form submission. And so that's really nice as well. Although it does kind of mix then the URL component and the form components, which is a bit strange. But I think it's okay, actually. That's okay. The funky bit is how we get the method dispatcher going. So I basically had to copy and paste this straight out of the documentation because I don't think I could have figured it out by myself. I honestly don't know what else can go in this configuration thing because I don't want to have to know just to make this application work. This is bordering on too much work to make my little application work. But it does do what I need it to do, which is to change the dispatcher to what I need it to do. And then to fire off the server, I just call quick start. And I can get a WSGI application out of that by accessing a sub attribute, and that's all good. One of the things that's nice about CherryPy is for development, it does automatic code reloading when you change code on disk, so that's really nice. And all up, CherryPy is not too complex, but this config thing, kind of sullied it a little bit. There's a bit of magic. The request object, if you have to access it, is a global variable in the CherryPy module. That's fairly common, actually, which is just kind of weird. There's obviously some incredibly fun thread local stuff going on to make that work. So, yeah. All right. So that's CherryPy. It's pretty good. Web.py. Web.py had a really good website, and it was really easy to get going. It has a slightly different approach. It's like CherryPy in that you've got the HTTP method on objects, but it splits out to another level again, the mapping of the URLs to the actual classes that are being published. So the bare URL is handled by one class, and then /page name handled by another class, and then edit is handled by yet another class, which is pretty much like CherryPy. So this is the edit one. Web.py has this forms thing built into it, which seems neat until you start using it. It doesn't handle submit buttons. Like if you have a submit button in your form, you can't configure it into the forms thing to actually handle input. It's kind of weird. And so for the case that I'm doing here, I actually just ended up accessing the form data directly. And directly in web.py is not directly. It's through this bizarro web input call here, which is saying there's always a content variable and sometimes a submit and cancel. And then you get this bizarro object back. I had to delve into the source to figure out how that even worked. So, yeah, bit let down there. And then, so I've got my 3 classes. To serve those, I do a mapping between the URL and wait a second, that's a URL and a string, the name of the class. And then I look up the actual class by looking in a mapping, which is globals. I didn't like this at all. And the mapping is this flat tuple. It's like, we'll just take the pairs in the tuple as we go. It's just the most bizarre structure. It kind of blew me away when I first saw it. So yeah, oh, and the input function, by the way, that's another module global. So I don't know how that works. It's like the module global requests. It's just magic. You can get a WSGI function out of this. It's kind of hidden away, but basically app.wsgifunc will give you a WSGI thing that can be published. The nice thing about web.py is there's a bunch of extras. So there's sessions and OpenID and utilities, and there's some templating in there that I don't care about, and form handling, which I couldn't get working, and there's a DB abstraction, which I just didn't look into at all. But there is a bunch of stuff there. The next one I looked at was Bottle. Now this is kind of the first of a few that look very similar. Bottle is pretty straightforward. I've imported a bunch of stuff from the Bottle module, so get, redirect, abort, they're all straight from the Bottle module. So you basically say from Bottle import get for post, redirect, not found, or sorry, abort, and a few other things. Redirect raises a redirect exception. Abort raises a not found. Get slash says match a get request for slash. Match a get request for slash name. I mean, this is really, really simple. The docs are really good, straightforward, downloadable. The implementation is a single Python file. It's really easy to use. There is some global magic for request and response. But it does have these first class, get and post decorators, which I think are awesome. And that's configuring an application as it goes. It's configuring a default application, but you can create your own application and configure that separately. So you can configure multiple applications if you like. It's just making the kind of the default usage so much simpler. Request.post has the posted form variables. There's also a request.params, which combines get and post variables into one, and there's a few other access methods as well, so that's really nice. And this is just really straightforward, I think. And to serve it, run. Again, imported from Bottle. I had to look into the source, but there is a WSGI app that you can access to. It's just the default app.wsgi. It also has this concept of an app stack, but I didn't look into that, and I'm not really sure what the point is. It does have some extras. There's serving of static files, some adapters to other projects. There's a simple templating engine, which I've actually used, and a bunch of convenience functions. But it also has wrappers to other templating engines as well. And this is the entirety of my application, not counting, of course, the core wiki implementation. I mean, that's not much typing, and that's what I'm after. That's pretty cool. Itty is really similar to Bottle. I mean, look at this. Get, slash, get, pattern. Raise, redirect, raise, not found, that's okay. We're explicitly raising, that's okay. It's actually more explicit than Bottle, and I think that's nice. And again, we're importing all these directly from the Itty module. Unfortunately, the docs for Itty are much smaller, but as it turns out, Itty is a much smaller framework as well. It's got really good examples in the documentation, and it's really simple and straightforward. And again, we're looking at pretty much the same code as Bottle. It's just the patterns in the URLs are different. I mean, it even uses request.post. It's basically the same. Really weirdly, though, when you raise a redirect, you get a traceback in the log file. So that's kind of odd. And run Itty runs the server. You can't make it simpler than that. And itty.handle request gives you the WSGI application to publish. So Itty, that's really nice. I won't show you the source code because it's basically the same as bottle. Flask. This is one that people talk about a lot. Flask is a little bit bigger. It depends on two external libraries, Ginger2 and Werkzeug, which is a separate WSGI toolkit. It does, however, have really good documentation, and it's the downloadable documentation, again, Sphinxified. Although the Werkzeug, you sometimes have to refer to the Werkzeug documentation, which is a bit of a pain. In particular, to get not found, I have to import that from Werkzeug, not from Flask. But redirect is imported from Flask. So that's a bit not right. Jumping back up to the top though, explicit app creation. There's no default app like in Bottle and Itty. So this isn't a bad thing. Explicit is good. We explicitly create the application and then we route based on that application. So that's nice. But again, in Itty and Bottle you can create, in Bottle you can create your own application and do this pattern if you wish to. There's no way to return a not found, and there's no way to raise a redirect. It's one way or the other. It's kind of weird. Yeah, I said that already. In the documentation, it wasn't immediately clear where request came from. They just used it. As it turns out, it's a module global in Flask, but it wasn't at all clear. So that was kind of odd. And again, we're looking at code that looks basically the same as Flask and Itty. It's just a slightly different invocation to do the routing. And we're using request.form instead of request.get, post. And yeah, the REST-ish request method stuff is handled as an optional argument to the route. So that's not too bad. And to run the application, we app.run. If we set debug equals true, we get this awesome debugger. And as basically, if the application crashes, you get in your browser an interactive session to debug your program. It's awesome. Yeah, so the app there, that's a WSGI application, so we can publish that. And Flask has a bunch of extras. So it's got Werkzeug, which has got a whole bunch of utilities. It has testing support built in. It's got the debugger, which is super cool. There's a secure cookies thing. There's Ginger2, which is bundled, but you can put that in anything, so it's not really a Flask extra. And there's a shell as well, which I didn't look into, which is pretty neat. But anyway, that's for another time. Okay, so the next one I looked at was Pesto. We're at number 8 of 10, so we're getting there. Okay, so Pesto is kind of like Flask, but a little bit more explicit. So it's basically you're creating your application and you've got your routing specifying the pattern and the request method. And in the pattern, you have to specify the type of the thing that's being pulled out of the URL as well. If you don't specify a type, there's no default. Dispatcher app and response, they're all imported from Pesto. So we explicitly wrap our response. Where are we? Down the bottom here. When we're returning our page, we can't just return the string. We have to return a response object. And there's no raising of redirect or not found. We have to return those. But that's okay. I prefer to raise these things sometimes, and it's nice to have that option. There is absolutely no magic going on here. Request, it's not a global module variable. It's passed in. There's no magic. Yes, I think that's... so it's really, really simple to use. I've written a couple of applications using Pesto already. Unfortunately, it's just a little bit more verbose than Bottle or even Flask, with the need to explicitly do the response and the request argument. But so be it. And as I say, the type is not optional. If you leave the type out, you get an error. It doesn't actually have a server built in. You just use the standard WSGI ref simple server. But that's not so bad. I mean, it means the app you've created is a WSGI app, so that's nice. It actually has some extras, like utilities for testing. I like frameworks that supply utilities for testing. I should have actually added that to my requirements, but I didn't, because I realised that far too late. It has support for sessions and caching, and obviously it does WSGI, which is nice. Second last is Werkzeug. I actually decided when I was doing Flask that I'd kind of delve deeper and actually try implementing something directly in Werkzeug because it seemed pretty capable. And in fact, it has really nice documentation and again, downloadable. The docs are kind of strangely laid out, and the sample program that they provide is actually more complex. It does more than the simple introductory program for Flask. It's kind of weird. It implements all this ORM stuff and templating and all this other stuff, whereas the Flask one is just more like Hello World, which was kind of odd. Having said that, it did explain a whole lot of stuff. It's just way more than I really cared about. There's no magic going on here. It occurs to me now that I look at it, that I could have raised a redirect. I probably could have raised a redirect, I didn't try this, from my Flask application by importing the redirect exception from Werkzeug, but there you go. It may work, may not, who knows. But there's no magic going on here. The URL mapping is done later, that's why there's no URL decorators here, but the core of this stuff is pretty straightforward. And again, if there's a name component in the URL, it'll be passed in. The request is passed in explicitly. There's no module global variable. Werkzeug's got this URL mapping thing that we can use to define the URL and the endpoint and the methods. It's all very explicit. But it's not too bad, not too burdensome. The downside with Werkzeug is there's no top-level application. I had to write my own top-level thing to look at those URLs and that URL mapping that I'd created with Werkzeug and call the thing that's nominated in there. It seems like the sort of thing that would be simple to just add to Werkzeug, but for some reason it's missing. So I had to, and I basically copy and pasted most of this from the Werkzeug documentation. So it's a little bit perplexing, and it took me a little while to get exactly right. So, yeah. Other than that, it's pretty easy to use. There's some extras in Werkzeug like sessions, generation of atom, which is a little bit of a left field one. There's the secure cookie stuff is actually implemented in Werkzeug, not in Flask, so Flask just kind of inherited it, and caching of requests. And again, I had to write my own WSGI application, so it doesn't really get the WSGI tick. Okay, so the last one I'm going to look at is Aspen.io. This one is truly the odd one out. It's a completely different approach to everything else. And it actually goes completely against my no templates rule, because you can't do anything without using templates. But it just looks so neat, I had to try it out. This is an Aspen template. It's got 3 sections delimited by page breaks, or in fact, if you type in explicit char and L, that'll count as well. You've got an initialization section, which is Python code. You've got a per request Python code section, and then you've got a template section, which is blank for this one because there's nothing being templated, nothing being returned to the user. So yeah, it's got this structure, and you'll see that more in some of the other slides. Yeah, there's a lot of conveniences that are in all the other app frameworks that are missing here, like there's no redirect exception or even response. You have to construct the thing yourself. If this file didn't have Python code in it, or if it didn't have the page breaks in it, it'd be served as static file, which is quite nice. So you can just, in your Aspen application, you can just whack in static files and they'll be served up, which is kind of neat. But this is all just a little bit magic and a little bit PHP, but we'll see. Okay, so the structure of the application is kind of like this. We have the index.html file you saw there. We have a .aspen directory where we can store things like a configuration file and Python modules we want to import in our application. And then %name, or any name really, but %name, Aspen sees that directory name and pulls that out of the URL and sets it as a variable in the request for us. It's kind of fun. So then in our %name/index.html file, the request, the per request code is in that middle section, but remember, we can pull the name that's been pulled out of the URL and use that in rendering our page based on the name. So that's kind of nice, but you can see at the top, every single page has to have this boilerplate, which is a bit yuck. And then I'm rendering the page, so my templating is just templating the page contents. I actually had to go after the tornado documentation to figure out whether or not that's escaped. And I gave up in the end, and I just ran it, and it turns out it's not escaped. So there you go, the HTML isn't escaped by default, which is a bit, not so happy about that. And I don't know how to escape it either. So the URLs are mapping to these file system paths, which is kind of nice. Unfortunately, there's no way of including the request method in that. So the handling of the request method is done explicitly in the page code. Another downside of Aspen is the documentation is seriously thin for developing this sort of application. So I had to go to the source to figure out what that request.body thing was and what its API was and how to actually access information. I had to read the source to figure out how to get a redirect back to the client. I had to read the source to figure out how to set the HTML content type because it's not edit.html, it's served as plain text. So yeah. I'm definitely not developing the sort of application that Aspen was designed for here. To serve Aspen, you can either just run the Aspen command in the directory and it'll serve Aspen, serve your application, or you can set up a Python program that does this. There's no way to get a WSGI application out of it though. I mean, I've given it maybe a little bit of a rough time here, but again, I don't think this is, I'm certain that what I'm doing is not what Aspen's designed for. And it actually looks like it'd be kind of neat to develop a simple application, a simple website with a bit of dynamic stuff in it. So, all right, I've got less than 10 minutes. Let's see how they all stack up. What I've done now is I'm going to score them with a simple +1 or -1 based on my criteria. You can see the running totals down the bottom there. Don't pay them much attention if you don't want to. We'll come back to the scores at the end. So, starting with documentation. I really liked the documentation of some of them. Some of them, the documentation really didn't help at all, and there was some middlings. I much preferred, obviously, the documentation that I can download, but Pesto still got a +1 because it was pretty good documentation. In terms of ease of use, some of them were clearly easier to use than, well, the CGI and WSGI ref. And I also took a point off of Aspen and Bobo. Again, I'm not really being fair to Aspen, but for sakes of giving an accurate idea of what's going on inside my head, I took a point off of it and Bobo because Bobo was not clear at all what was going on and it wasn't easy to use. In terms of avoiding magic, basically module level request variables are considered magic, and I'm taking a point off for that. Itty, what was that? I can't remember what that point was about. Oh yes, it wasn't easy to find. In Itty, the WSGI environment is present as request._environ, and it's not, I actually had a conversation with the author of Itty about that, and he's like, yeah, what? I'm like, but you want to access it, why has it got an underscore? Why are you pretending to hide it? And he's like, yeah, whatever. So, and of course, there's absolutely no magic in CGI, WSGI ref, Werkzeug or Pesto, which can make them a bit more effort. In terms of RESTful, most of them handled it. Some of them it wasn't obvious how it handled it, and Aspen and CGI, WSGI ref, obviously not so much. And basically, ignoring Aspen, there were basically the two approaches. There was, you're decorating things, you're decorating callables, and otherwise you're creating some listing of mappings to callables. And that's basically how things kind of settle down in terms of the URL mapping. Just, out of interest. On the WSGI side, yeah, pretty much all of them supported WSGI. Some of them it wasn't as obvious as others. Some of them I had to write the WSGI. I don't know what CGI WSGI, oh, it's kind of, no, I mean, I had to write the application, so I don't think CGI WSGI really should get the point here, thinking about it. So we'll just keep that in mind. Python 3. 3 of these solutions supported Python 3 out of the box. Ignoring the standard library, Bottle and CherryPy points to you. Everybody else, basically, no. So that'd be nice to get, improved. One of the things holding things back is, of course, a lot of these use WebOb under the hood, and WebOb is currently being made Python 3 happy. That's an ongoing project, so we hope that kind of comes out soon. PyPy, they all run under PyPy, and that's really props to the PyPy team as much as anything else. And that was a real surprise. That's just awesome. That was with the last release. That's 1.5. That's not even 1.6, which was just released. So that was really nice. In terms of effort that I had to expend to write these things, Bottle and Itty tied for lines of code, but Bottle was just a few characters less. And of course, the most typing down the bottom here with CGI and WSGI. And I kind of arbitrarily cut the line there above CherryPy because CherryPy just felt like too much typing with that whole conf thing. Yeah. In terms of the frameworks though, Itty, 593 lines of code. How awesome. And then there's hardly anything to CGI and WSGI, so obviously it's in there. But Bottle, again, such a short, it's a single file and a very little amount of code to get to do what it does. And as I say, it's got a bunch of adapters and stuff in there as well. And then I kind of arbitrarily cut the line there, and I just thought, CherryPy and Flask, which I had to delve into the code for a few times, there's just too much there to simply go in and find out how things are working. So they get a point off. So the official scores, according to me, Bottle, quite clearly the winner out of all of this. Although, Pesto, which is, less, it's more verbose because it's more explicit, still comes in a pretty close second. And Itty, a fair showing there. And again, I'm really not being fair to Aspen. I shouldn't have included in the totals. But Bobo and CherryPy, CherryPy's got some neat features, but there's a fair bit going against it in my criteria. So I've actually, since I finished this roundup, I've actually started using Bottle for actual application development, and I'm finding it really nice to use. So I think I might actually be onto a winner. Just as a final note, okay, so yes, Bottle, simple to use, great docs, RESTful, WSGI, Python 3, a single file implementation, compact application code. It can't get better than that, I don't think. And there's just a little note here, some of the extras that you get with the different frameworks, I actually mentioned them in passing, but this is just a little table to leave up there. I have 3 minutes left, I think, and 2 minutes left. If there's time, there's probably time for one question, so make it good if you've got a question. I may or may not answer it. Oh, we'll just wait for the microphone. I could always repeat, given we don't have much time.
Can you describe the utilities for testing in Pesto?
Can I describe the utilities for testing in Pesto? Sadly, I cannot, I'm afraid. From memory, and this is straight from memory, I believe it just simply allows you to construct a pretend WSGI application and feed it information and handle responses and things like that. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's how most of them that support testing do things. They provide the ability for you to construct a request to feed into your application and handle the response.
One more question.
One more?
Anybody's got anything?
Way over here, Aaron.
I just want to ask, considering the Bottle doesn't come with a few extras that Flask does, would you still consider using Bottle over Flask if you needed things like sessions or?
Oh no, absolutely. If I was developing a real website, I would not use Bottle. Right. I would probably use Flask or Django if I was developing a real website that had a real user interface and had real users. But what I'm developing is not that. Right. Not in this case. Yes. In fact, the last application I developed that had actual users, the user authentication was in a single form. Enter the details of the request you want to make and type your username into the bottom field and hit go. And that was it. So that's the sort of thing I deal with sometimes.
All right, I think we're out of time now, so thank you very much, Richard.